It all started on a Saturday morning. My parents were going away for the weekend, something about a last-minute family event out of town. They trusted me enough to leave me home alone, which I thought was pretty cool. Finally, some freedom. No one around to tell me to clean up my room or turn down the music. I had everything planned out: movies, junk food, maybe even a little gaming if I got bored. The whole day was mine. The house was super quiet after they left. It felt different, like the silence was louder than usual. If that makes sense. You know how when someone leaves, the place just seems empty? That's how it was. But I wasn't worried. I was just soaking in the peace and quiet, enjoying the fact that I didn't have to answer to anyone for the next 48 hours. By mid-morning, I had settled onto the couch with a bag of chips, flipping through Netflix. I had just started watching a random horror movie. Yeah, bad choice in hindsight, when I heard a creak coming from upstairs. Now, my house is old. Like really old. Creaky floors, weird noises. It's not out of the ordinary. Still, when you're home alone, every little sound feels 10 times louder, right? So I paused the movie and listened, but nothing else happened. Just silence. I told myself it was probably just the wind or the house settling. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but there was something off. Maybe it was because I had just started watching a horror movie. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when you're already a little freaked out? That had to be it. I pressed play again and forced myself to relax. A few minutes passed, and just when I was getting into the movie, something dropped upstairs. It was louder this time, like something heavy had fallen. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the ceiling, waiting for, I don't know, another sound? But everything went dead quiet again. I debated whether to check it out or not. My brain was saying, stay on the couch, it's nothing, but my gut was telling me to go look. So, against my better judgment, I got up and headed for the stairs. Each step I took felt like it echoed through the whole house. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase, straining my ears, but the silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring up into the darkness of the hallway. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. After a few seconds, I decided it wasn't worth it. I mean, it was broad daylight. What was I expecting to find? A ghost? A burglar? I laughed at myself, shaking my head, and went back to the couch. As I sat down, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from my mom checking in. How's everything going? You doing okay? I almost told her about the noise, but decided not to. She'd probably just laugh, or worse, cut their trip short thinking I couldn't handle a couple of hours by myself. Instead, I just texted back, everything's fine. I mean, I wasn't lying. Everything was fine. Or at least I hoped it was. I went back to my movie, trying to shake off that lingering uneasiness, but deep down, something didn't feel right. And I had no idea that was just the beginning. By the time afternoon rolled around, the weather had started to change. The sun had disappeared behind thick, dark clouds, and I could hear the wind picking up outside. It wasn't anything too crazy at first, just the kind of windy day where the trees sway and the leaves swirl around. But something about the sky felt heavy. It was the kind of sky that promised a storm. I had just finished the horror movie, which, by the way, turned out to be way scarier than I expected. I was feeling a little jumpy, but I tried to laugh it off. I mean, it's just a movie, right? So, I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through social media, trying to shake that weird feeling that was still nagging at me. That's when I heard it, a sound from the kitchen. It wasn't super loud, but it was definitely there. It sounded like something metal, maybe a pan or a pot, being moved, slowly, like someone was dragging it across the counter. My body tensed up immediately. I mean, there was no way that should have happened. I hadn't been in the kitchen since breakfast, and I definitely didn't leave anything out. For a second, I just sat there, frozen, listening. My heart was starting to pound in my chest. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe it was the wind. Yeah, that had to be it. The wind was probably rattling something in the kitchen. But as much as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone, holding it like some kind of safety blanket, and stood up. Slowly, I made my way toward the kitchen, trying to be as quiet as possible. With each step, I could feel my pulse racing, my ears straining for any other sound. When I finally reached the kitchen doorway, I hesitated. I didn't really want to look. What if there was someone in there? My brain started playing out every worst-case scenario. But I couldn't just stand there forever. So, taking a deep breath, I stepped into the kitchen. It was empty. Everything was in its place. The pots and pans were hanging on their hooks, the dishes were in the sink, and the countertops were clean. No sign that anything had been moved at all. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe I was just being paranoid after all. Maybe I was still on edge from that stupid horror movie. But then I noticed something strange. One of the chairs at the kitchen table was pulled out. I didn't remember leaving it like that. In fact, I was sure I hadn't. My parents were neat freaks, and I always pushed the chairs in after I ate. I walked over and pushed the chair back under the table, trying not to think too much about it. Still, that weird feeling wouldn't go away. Something was off. But again, I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, chairs get bumped, and the wind was howling pretty hard now. It was probably all just a coincidence. I was alone, my mind was playing tricks on me, right? As I stood there in the kitchen, trying to calm down, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from my mom. "How's it going? Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment, considering whether or not to tell her what had just happened. But then I thought about how ridiculous it would sound. "Hey Mom, I think the wind moved a chair." "Yeah?" No. I didn't want to freak her out, especially since it was probably nothing. Instead, I texted back, "Everything's fine, just watching some movies." After hitting send, I put my phone back in my pocket, trying to focus on something else. I walked back to the living room and flopped down on the couch again, flipping through Netflix to find something else to watch. But as the wind outside picked up even more and the sky darkened, I couldn't help but glance toward the kitchen every now and then. It was just too quiet in the house. Then came another noise. This time, it wasn't from the kitchen. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs. A faint thud, like something had been dropped. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, staring at the ceiling, listening closely. It wasn't the same sound as before. This was more deliberate, heavier. I tried to tell myself that it was just the house settling. You know how old houses can be? They creak and shift when the weather changes. But deep down, I knew it didn't sound like that. It sounded like something or someone was moving upstairs. I thought about going to check it out, but my legs felt like they were glued to the couch. The logical part of my brain was telling me to just go look, to stop being such a wimp, but the rest of me was screaming, "Stay where you are." I didn't know what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I grabbed my phone and sent a quick message to one of my friends. "Hey, are you busy? Want to come over later?" No response. I stared at the screen, waiting, hoping for something to break the tension. But nothing. The minutes ticked by, and the silence in the house started to feel suffocating. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the faint creaking of the house. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but as the storm outside grew louder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something asterisk or someone asterisk was in the house with me. By the time evening rolled around, the storm had fully taken over. The rain was slamming against the windows like someone was throwing buckets of water at the house, and the wind howled so loudly that I could hear it over the TV. The sky outside had turned an unsettling shade of dark gray, almost black, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the room for a split second. It was the kind of storm where you can just feel the power about to go out. I was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to pretend everything was fine. The weird noises from earlier? Forgotten. The storm was a perfect distraction. I switched to a comedy movie, something light to get my mind off the eerie vibes the house was giving off. I even laughed at a few jokes, trying to convince myself that it was just a normal night alone. But then, just as the characters on screen were in the middle of some silly argument, boom, the house went completely dark. For a moment, I just sat there in stunned silence, my eyes wide and my heart pounding. There wasn't even a second of flickering lights like you sometimes get before a blackout. Everything just died. The TV, the lights, everything. The only thing left was the sound of the storm raging outside and the almost deafening silence inside the house. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking a bit. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but there's something about sudden darkness that makes your brain immediately assume the worst. My heart was racing, and I kept expecting something or someone to suddenly appear in the shadows. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the small beam of light cutting through the pitch-black living room. The light didn't reach far, but it was better than nothing. Okay, calm down, I whispered to myself. It's just a power outage. No big deal. Happens all the time. I stood up and scanned the room, just in case. Everything looked the same. The furniture was where it always was, nothing seemed out of place, and yet the air felt heavier. It was like the darkness brought a whole new layer of tension to the house. I knew what I had to do. Check the breaker box in the basement. I had never actually dealt with a power outage by myself before, but I'd seen my dad do it a few times. It couldn't be that hard, right? As I walked through the house, the beam from my phone bounced around, making the shadows dance on the walls. The usual creaks of the house seemed louder, more ominous now that everything else was silent. The storm outside was still raging, and the rain was hammering against the windows so hard I could barely hear my own footsteps. When I got to the basement door, I froze. The door was slightly open. Not wide open, just enough that it seemed wrong. I never went down to the basement unless I absolutely had to, and I was sure I hadn't been down there in days. So, why was the door open? My stomach twisted in knots, and I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should go down there or not. I mean, it was probably nothing. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way the last time I went down. Or maybe one of my parents had left it open before they left. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew something felt off. I shone my phone's flashlight down the stairs, but all I could see was darkness. The stairs creaked as the wind rattled the house, making it sound like someone was moving down there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, and I had a sudden urge to just turn around and forget the whole thing. Who needs power, right? But I couldn't just leave it. If I didn't check the breaker, I'd be stuck in the dark all night. So, taking a deep breath and trying to steady my nerves, I started down the stairs. Each step creaked louder than the last, and the air down there felt colder. Damp too. The smell of mildew hit me as I reached the bottom, and the dim light from my phone barely illuminated the space. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, random tools, and that weird stuff that just collects over the years in a place you never really clean. My dad kept most of his tools down here, and the breaker box was on the far wall, tucked behind some shelves. I made my way across the room, keeping the light trained ahead of me, half expecting to see something or someone jump out at any second. Every little noise felt amplified down there, from the drip of water in some far-off corner to the rustle of something small moving behind a box. I told myself it was probably just a mouse. Probably. I finally reached the breaker box and opened it. The switches were all in their normal positions. I flicked the main switch off and then back on again like I'd seen my dad do 100 times. Nothing happened. No click, no hum, no return of power. Just the same suffocating darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet slowly across the concrete floor. My entire body went rigid. The sound was behind me. I spun around, the light from my phone swinging wildly across the room, but there was nothing. Just shadows. The boxes and shelves stood exactly where they had been. But the sound, I hadn't imagined it. Something someone had moved. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears, and my skin prickled with fear. I didn't dare move for a few long moments, just standing there, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Silence. I bolted. I turned and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my foot almost slipping on the second-to-last step as I fumbled for the door handle. I yanked it open and slammed it shut behind me, my chest heaving with panic. I didn't even bother looking back. The lights were still out, but I didn't care. There was no way I was going back down there. I leaned against the basement door for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my phone light the only thing keeping the dark from swallowing me whole. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong. I stood there, back pressed against the basement door, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing. That sound, that shuffling sound, there was no way it was just my imagination. Something or someone had been down there with me. I tried to reason with myself, try to convince myself that it was just the house settling or the wind making something move around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to move away from the door. I needed to think, needed to figure out what to do next. The power was still out, and my phone was at about 30% battery. I needed to stay calm, but that was becoming harder by the minute. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling like something wild. The house felt different, like it was watching me. I decided to call my parents, just to hear a familiar voice, to feel like I wasn't so alone. I pulled out my phone, swiped to my mom's contact, and hit call. It rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. I tried my dad next, but it was the same, straight to voicemail. Great. I thought about calling a friend, but it was a little embarrassing to admit I was this freaked out. What was I even going to say? Hey, I'm alone in the dark and I think my house is haunted or something? They'd probably just laugh it off or tell me I was being paranoid. And maybe I was, but still. Suddenly, the quiet of the house was broken by a loud crash from the kitchen. It sounded like something had been knocked over, a chair, maybe, or one of the pots hanging on the wall. My heart jumped into my throat, and I could feel my legs starting to shake. I should go check it out. But my body wasn't cooperating. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put, lock the doors, and wait for help. But what help? My parents were unreachable, and the power outage made everything worse. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, I walked toward the kitchen, the beam from my phone's flashlight flickering as if it, too, was afraid of what I might find. The house was eerily quiet now, except for the wind and rain outside. Each step I took felt like it echoed through the house. When I finally reached the kitchen, I froze at the doorway. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. At first glance, everything looked normal. The pots and pans were still hanging from their hooks. The chairs were pushed in around the table. But then I saw it. The door to the pantry, which I knew I had closed earlier, was wide open. And one of the chairs, the one I had pushed back under the table earlier, was tipped over on its side, as if someone had knocked it over in a hurry. My stomach twisted into knots. I took a step forward, holding the light out in front of me, trying to see into the pantry. The shelves were lined with canned goods, cereal boxes, and other random food items. Everything seemed fine. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been there. But that didn't make me feel any better. Suddenly, the lights flickered on for a brief second, just long enough to bathe the kitchen in a dim, almost sickly yellow glow. My heart leapt with hope, thinking the power was coming back, but just as quickly, the lights flickered off again, plunging the house back into darkness. That flicker was all I needed to realize something important. The back door, the one that led out to the yard, was unlocked. The faint light had revealed the deadbolt, half turned but not fully engaged. I had definitely locked it earlier. I rushed over, my hands trembling as I twisted the lock into place, securing the door. My mind was racing now. Had someone been inside the house? Had they come in while I was in the basement? The thought made my skin crawl. I turned around, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing in the corner. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the kitchen, the cold wind pressing against the windows, and the persistent patter of rain. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the block on the counter, feeling ridiculous, but also a little more secure holding it. If someone was messing with me, they were about to get a nasty surprise. But then again, what if I was just losing it? What if all of this was just the storm and my imagination running wild? As I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard another sound. This time, it was faint, a soft creaking like someone, asterisk or something asterisk, was walking around upstairs. My heart dropped into my stomach. I hadn't been upstairs since the morning, and I was absolutely certain there was no one up there. At least there shouldn't have been. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. The sound stopped, leaving the house in an unbearable silence. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't stay down here forever. If someone was upstairs, I needed to know. I needed to check. But the thought of going up there made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, gripping the knife tighter, weighing my options. I could leave, run out into the storm and find help. But then what? I'd be leaving the house wide open. And what if no one believed me? I was stuck, and the only thing I could think to do was face whatever was making that noise. I forced myself to move toward the stairs, my legs shaking as I made my way to the second floor. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and narrow. The sound had come from one of the bedrooms, but I couldn't tell which one. I swallowed hard, inching my way forward, every step making the floorboards creak beneath my feet. I stopped in front of the guest room. The door was open, just a crack, enough for me to see inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, pushing the door open slowly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside. I shone my phone's light inside, scanning the room. Nothing. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched. But then I noticed something odd. The window was slightly open. Not much, just a crack, but enough for a cold draft to seep in. My blood ran cold. I hadn't opened that window. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time anyone had opened it. I moved to close it, but as I did, something brushed against my arm. I jumped back, heart racing, shining the light in all directions, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. Just the empty room, the curtains swaying slightly from the wind. I slammed the window shut, my hands trembling. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. Something was in this house with me, and it wasn't just my imagination. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was from that same unknown number. I'm already inside. I stared at my phone, my breath caught in my throat. The message on the screen sent a cold wave of terror through me. I'm already inside. My hands shook as I reread the text, hoping, praying, that I'd somehow misunderstood. But no, it was clear as day. Someone had sent this to me, and they claimed to be in the house with me. I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't one of my friends, and my parents wouldn't mess around with something like this. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. My first instinct was to text back, to ask who it was or demand they stop messing with me. But the logical part of my brain quickly shut that idea down. Whoever sent this wanted me to respond, wanted me to be scared. And I was. More scared than I had ever been in my life. I looked around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The guest room was dark, the curtains still swaying slightly from the breeze that had come in through the now-closed window. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no noise. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. I backed out of the room slowly, not daring to turn my back on it, and pulled the door shut behind me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I had to get out of the house. That much was clear. Whoever, or whatever, was sending these messages wasn't joking around. I rushed downstairs, my footsteps barely audible over the storm still raging outside. The rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the house. I headed straight for the front door, my phone still clenched in my hand. I reached for the doorknob and twisted. It didn't budge. My stomach dropped. I jiggled the knob again, harder this time, but it was stuck. I quickly realized the deadbolt was still in place. I must have locked it earlier when I first started getting nervous about the noises. With shaky hands, I turned the deadbolt, but before I could open the door, something stopped me. A loud knock, right on the other side. I froze, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. Someone was right there, standing just beyond the door. My mind flashed to the message on my phone. They're already inside. For a moment, I just stood there paralyzed. Then the knock came again, louder and more insistent this time, echoing through the silent house. Whoever it was wasn't going away. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and slowly leaned forward to peek through the peephole. My hands were shaking so badly it was hard to steady myself. But eventually, I pressed my eye against the small glass circle and squinted into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring my vision, and the front porch light was out because of the power outage. But then, a figure shifted in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but I could see someone tall, drenched from the rain, standing there unmoving. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Who the hell was that? And why weren't they saying anything? They hadn't called out, hadn't identified themselves, just knocked. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct in my body told me to stay away, to lock everything and wait for the storm to pass. But what if it was a neighbor or someone in trouble? What if they needed help? My phone buzzed in my hand again. Another message. Open the door. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. How did they know I was right here, standing by the door? I hadn't made a sound, hadn't even moved, but they knew. Somehow, they knew. Suddenly, another knock echoed through the house, this time from the back door. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. There was no way someone could have gotten back there so fast. I had just seen them at the front door. I spun around, staring down the hallway that led to the kitchen. The back door was hidden behind the wall, but I knew it was there just out of sight. And now, someone was standing on the other side of it, knocking, waiting. My mind was in overdrive, panic clawing at me from every angle. Was it the same person? Were there two of them? How were they moving so quickly? I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed to get out, get help. I rushed toward the back door, despite every fiber of my being screaming not to. As I reached the kitchen, I paused for a second, listening hard. The knocking had stopped. I reached out slowly, ready to unlock the door and make a run for it. But just as my fingers brushed the lock, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Faint, slow footsteps coming from upstairs. I whipped around, the knife still clenched tightly in my hand, staring up the stairs. The house was still pitch black, save for the faint light from my phone, but I knew what I had heard. The footsteps were real, coming closer, moving steadily toward the top of the staircase. I stood frozen, my back against the kitchen door, trying to decide whether to run or to hide. My body was shaking uncontrollably, every nerve on edge. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone or something was descending the stairs. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, making me jump. It came from the front of the house, the sound of something slamming against the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. Without thinking, I grabbed the back door handle and threw it open, letting the storm outside crash into the kitchen. The wind whipped around me, and rain pelted my face as I stepped out onto the back porch. The air was freezing, and the darkness outside seemed to stretch endlessly, but I didn't care. I was out of the house. That was all that mattered. As I stepped into the yard, drenched and shaking, I turned to look back at the house. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure, watching me from one of the upstairs windows. But as soon as I blinked, it was gone. My phone buzzed one more time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I unlocked the screen with trembling fingers and read the message. Too late. I dropped the phone and ran. I don't think I'd ever run as fast as I did that night. The rain was coming down in sheets, drenching me to the bone in seconds, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from the house as possible. My phone lay abandoned on the wet grass behind me. The message, asterisk, asterisk, too late, asterisk, asterisk, still burning in my mind. I could barely see in front of me through the darkness and the storm, but I knew I had to find help. The wind was howling, and the trees bent dangerously under its force, their branches snapping like brittle bones. I had no real plan. My neighbors lived a couple of streets over, but in this storm, it felt like they were a million miles away. I stumbled as my foot sank into a puddle, but I caught myself just before hitting the ground. Every part of me wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the wind and rain would have swallowed the sound before it even left my mouth. Then, in the middle of the chaos, I stopped. Something was wrong. Through the wind, through the pounding of the rain, I heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A soft, persistent knock. My heart leapt into my throat. It wasn't coming from the front door like before, or even from the back door where I had just escaped. This knock was closer, much closer. And it wasn't just one knock. It was repeating. Knock, knock, knock. I turned slowly, dread curling up in my stomach like a heavy stone. There, not 20 feet away, stood the figure. The same figure I had seen through the peephole just moments ago. It was hard to make out any details through the rain, but they were tall, their outline flickering like a shadow in the storm. They stood completely still, save for the slow, rhythmic knocking. But there was no door in front of them, no wall. They were knocking on the air, on nothing at all. My blood ran cold. How could they be out here? I had just seen them at the front door, then the back door, then heard them inside the house. And now they were here in the yard with me. For a long moment, we just stood there, me panting, soaked, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, and them, silent, still, knocking in the storm. It was like they were mocking me, like this slow, deliberate sound was a message meant just for me. Knock, knock, knock. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran again, harder this time, legs burning as I pushed through the rain. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who was that? Why were they doing this? Was it even a person? Some twisted part of me couldn't help but think back to all the horror movies I had watched, the ones where the haunted figure is always just a few steps behind, no matter how fast you run. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. I was living it. I reached the end of my yard and skidded to a halt, breathing hard, my body shaking from the cold and fear. The street stretched out in front of me, empty and slick with rain. My neighbors' houses were barely visible through the storm, their lights all out from the power outage. I wanted to run to one of them, bang on the door, and beg to be let in, but something stopped me. I felt eyes on me again. I turned around and there they were. The figure, standing at the edge of my yard, still in that same spot, still motionless, still knocking. It was impossible. No one could move that fast. No one could follow me so silently in a storm like this. But they had, and they weren't even out of breath. The knock continued, slow, deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Knock, knock, knock. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, when I heard something else. A different sound this time. The knock had stopped, replaced by something even more terrifying. Footsteps. Wet, squelching footsteps coming toward me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Down the street, past the darkened houses, through the sheets of rain. My legs were burning, my lungs aching, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I felt like if I stopped, the thing would catch me, drag me back to wherever it had come from, and I'd never see daylight again. After what felt like hours, I saw a light in the distance. Dim, but steady, cutting through the storm. It was Lisa's house, my neighbor who lived 3 doors down. The light was coming from her front porch, flickering like it was running off a generator. I had never been so relieved in my life. Lisa always seemed to have everything together. If anyone could help me, it was her. I sprinted toward the house, practically slipping and sliding up the front steps. I pounded on the door, my fist slamming against the wood, frantic. Lisa, it's me. Please open the door. Please. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. No sound from inside. The rain poured harder, soaking me even more, as if that was possible. I could barely hear my own voice over the storm, but I kept knocking, yelling her name over and over. Finally, the door creaked open, just a crack. I saw her face, pale and wide-eyed, peeking through the gap. She looked as freaked out as I felt. "Why are you outside?" she asked, her voice shaky, barely audible over the storm. "Lisa, you have to let me in," I gasped, my words coming out in a rush. "There's someone out here. They've been following me. They were in my house, and they're still out here somewhere. Please, I don't know what's going on, but..." Before I could finish, a loud bang came from behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but saw nothing but the dark, empty street. The figure wasn't there anymore. They had vanished, or were hiding, watching. Lisa opened the door wider and quickly motioned for me to come inside. I didn't hesitate. I practically fell through the doorway, collapsing on her living room floor, gasping for breath. The warmth of the house hit me like a wall, but I couldn't relax. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my soaked clothes clinging to my skin. Lisa closed the door behind me, locking it tightly before turning to face me. She was pale, her hands trembling as she twisted the lock back and forth. Something was wrong. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered. I looked up at her, confused, but the words caught in my throat. "The knocking," she said quietly, her eyes wide with fear. "You weren't the only one." Just as she spoke those words, the lights in her house flickered. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across Lisa's living room. For a split second, the room plunged into darkness, and my heart dropped into my stomach. The power was flickering again, threatening to leave us in total darkness. I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably as I sat on Lisa's floor, trying to catch my breath. But her words echoed in my mind. "You heard it too, didn't you? You still here?" Confused. "What do you mean? What did you hear?" Lisa swallowed hard, her hands still shaking as she twisted them together. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and locked the door behind us again, as if she couldn't trust that it was secure. Then, without meeting my eyes, she whispered, "The knocking? It's been happening to me too." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with being soaked. I forced myself to stand, my knees weak from fear and exhaustion. "What do you mean? How long has it been happening?" She turned to face me, her eyes wide with the same terror I felt. "It started about a week ago. Every night, right around midnight, I hear someone knocking. First on the front door, then the back. But when I look outside, there's no one there. At first, I thought it was just kids messing around, but she trailed off, biting her lip. But what?" I pressed, my heart racing. Lisa hesitated before continuing. "One night, I opened the door just to check. I thought maybe someone really needed help. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Then, I heard the knocking again, but from inside the house. A wave of nausea hit me. This couldn't be real. I shook my head, trying to process everything she was saying. But why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you call the police?" She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter, hollow. What would I even say? "Hey, there's a ghost knocking on my door?" They'd think I was crazy. I didn't even believe it myself at first. I sank onto the couch, my head spinning. This was too much. First the messages, then the figure at my door, the knocking, and now this. It was like something straight out of a nightmare, but it was real. It was happening to both of us. Before I could ask Lisa anything else, we heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, like someone slowly creeping across the hardwood floor upstairs. Both of us froze, our eyes darting toward the ceiling. The footsteps were steady, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't in any rush. They moved slowly, almost casually, like they knew we were listening. Lisa's face drained of color. "No," she whispered, backing away from the door. "It's never been in here before." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean? What's never been in here?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "It's always been outside. It's never come inside before." My blood ran cold. Whatever had been knocking on my doors, whatever had been chasing me outside in the storm, it was now inside Lisa's house. And it was moving toward us. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could tell they were coming from the upstairs hallway. I stood up, my body tense, every muscle ready to bolt, but I had no idea where to go. We were trapped. The storm was still raging outside, and now something was stalking us inside. "What do we do?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. Lisa looked at me, her face pale with fear. "I don't know. It's never come inside." The footsteps stopped. Complete silence filled the house. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the rain pelting against the windows. For a moment, it was as if the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. Then, the silence was broken by a loud, creaking sound, the unmistakable sound of a door slowly opening upstairs. I felt my stomach drop. Something was moving. Something was coming. Without thinking, I grabbed Lisa's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen. "We need to hide," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm, even though every part of me was screaming to run. "Now!" We rushed into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under our weight. I opened the pantry door, and we both squeezed inside. It was cramped and dark, and we could barely breathe in the tiny space, but it was the only place I could think of. I pulled the door closed, leaving just the smallest crack so we could see into the kitchen. We sat there, in complete darkness, our breathing shallow and quiet. I could feel Lisa shaking beside me, but neither of us dared to speak. We just listened. The house was silent again, except for the occasional crack of thunder and the pounding rain. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and nothing happened. My heart started to slow down, and for a moment I thought maybe asterisk, just maybe asterisk, whatever had been upstairs was gone. But then we heard it. Footsteps again. Louder this time. Closer. My breath caught in my throat as I peeked through the crack in the door. I couldn't see much, just the empty kitchen, illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning outside. But the footsteps were getting closer, moving down the stairs now. Each step seemed to echo through the house, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking knew exactly where we were. I grabbed Lisa's hand tighter, and we both held our breath as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The air in the pantry felt suffocating, heavy with fear. Then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the kitchen. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something, or someone, was standing just outside the pantry door. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure it could hear us. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to go away, for the storm to take it with it. But instead, the pantry door creaked open. Just an inch. I froze, too terrified to move. The door was still mostly closed, but it had shifted slightly, just enough to make me feel exposed. Vulnerable. A shadow passed across the floor outside the door. I could barely make it out in the darkness, but it was there, standing right outside. And then the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't on the front door this time, or the back door. It was coming from right there inside the kitchen, right outside the pantry. The sound was soft, rhythmic, but it felt like each knock was driving a spike of fear deeper into my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and wait. But I couldn't move. Neither could Lisa. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Complete silence. I waited, my body trembling, every muscle tense for whatever was about to happen next. But nothing came. No footsteps, no sound. Just the deafening quiet. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to peek through the crack in the pantry door. The kitchen was empty. The shadow was gone. I let out a shaky breath and turned to Lisa, whispering, "I think it's gone." But before I could finish the sentence, we heard it. A voice. Low, quiet, almost like a whisper. "I know you're in there." My heart stopped. "I know you're in there." The voice was soft, almost too soft to hear over the storm. But it was enough. Enough to send every nerve in my body screaming, to make my blood run cold. I glanced at Lisa, her eyes wide with terror, her face pale in the dim light. She shook her head ever so slightly, as if telling me not to react, not to make a sound. But the fear was unbearable. We sat there in the cramped darkness of the pantry, barely breathing. My mind raced, trying to figure out who or what was speaking. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It didn't even sound entirely human. The way it spoke, slow and deliberate, was unnatural. Too calm for the situation. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I waited for something to happen, for the door to be flung open, for the figure to step inside. But the voice remained quiet, taunting us from just outside the door. "I can hear you breathing," it said, a hint of amusement in its tone. I squeezed Lisa's hand, trying to keep her calm, even though I felt like I was on the verge of panic myself. We had no way out. If we made a break for it, whoever was out there would catch us for sure. The only thing we could do was stay as still as possible, hope they'd leave, and try not to let the fear take over. Then something moved. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet shuffle of feet. My pulse quickened. It was right outside. I could almost feel its presence through the thin, wooden door. Suddenly, there was a loud bang as something slammed against the pantry door. I jumped, a strangled gasp escaping my throat before I could stop it. Lisa clamped her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. I pressed my back against the shelves behind me, my body shaking uncontrollably. The voice chuckled, low, menacing, like it was enjoying our fear. "I knew you were here," it whispered. There was another bang, and this time, the door rattled on its hinges. It was trying to get in. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. We had no time, no options. I wasn't sure how much longer the door would hold, and I had no idea what would happen when it finally gave way. I looked around, desperately searching for something, Asterisk anything asterisk we could use to defend ourselves. My eyes landed on a heavy cast iron skillet sitting on a low shelf beside me. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed it, the weight of it reassuring in my trembling hands. I gave Lisa a quick look, trying to tell her without words that I was going to fight, that we weren't just going to sit there and wait for whatever was out there to get us. She nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also determination. She reached down and picked up a can of beans from the pantry shelf. It was ridiculous, but at that moment, it felt like we were arming ourselves for war. The voice outside had gone silent again, but I could feel it, whatever it was waiting, watching. It knew we were trapped, and it was playing with us, drawing out the terror. I couldn't take it anymore. Before I could talk myself out of it, I swung the pantry door open. The sudden movement made my breath catch in my throat. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. The room looked just as it had when we hid, empty and quiet. But the figure was there, standing in the middle of the kitchen, barely visible in the flickering light. Tall, impossibly tall, with a dark hood covering its face. Its form was human-like, but there was something off about it. Something wrong. It didn't move. It just stood there, as if it had been waiting for us to come out. I tightened my grip on the skillet, my knuckles turning white. I wasn't sure if I had the courage to use it, but I knew we couldn't just stand there. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound brave. The figure didn't respond at first. It just tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, amused by my question. Then, in that same low, eerie voice, it finally spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The word sent a chill down my spine. I had no idea what it meant, but I didn't have time to think. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements smooth and deliberate. I backed up instinctively, bumping into Lisa, who was standing frozen behind me. "I don't know what you want," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you need to leave. Now!" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took another step toward us. I raised the skillet, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but I didn't know if I could actually use it. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, like none of this was real. Suddenly, Lisa broke the silence. "Go away," she shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "Leave us alone." The figure stopped, its head turning slightly toward her. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it stepped back. The movement was unnatural, almost like it was being pulled by invisible strings. And then it laughed. The sound was low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within its chest. It didn't sound human. It didn't even sound real. It was a laugh filled with malice, with dark amusement. My stomach twisted with dread. "Leave," the voice asked, mocking us. "You think you can make me leave?" The figure stepped forward again, faster this time. I felt a surge of panic. This was it. We had no more time. Without thinking, I swung the skillet with all my strength. It connected with something solid, and there was a loud crack. The figure staggered back, its head falling away to reveal nothing. There was no face, no head, just a dark, swirling void where a face should have been. The sight of it made my stomach churn, my vision spinning with horror. But the figure didn't stop. It came at us again, faster now, more aggressive. I swung the skillet again, but it passed through the air as if the figure wasn't even solid anymore. My heart sank. Lisa grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Run!" she screamed, and without thinking, we bolted out of the kitchen, through the hallway, and toward the front door. But as we reached the door, a loud bang echoed from behind us, and we skidded to a halt. The figure was there in front of the door, blocking our only escape. Its body seemed to flicker in and out of the shadows, as if it wasn't fully part of this world. It tilted its head again, that horrible laugh echoing through the house. "There's nowhere to run." The voice was right. We were trapped. There's nowhere to run. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. Lisa and I stood frozen in front of the door, staring at the figure that seemed to blur in and out of the shadows. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, like it was sucking all the warmth and light out of the room. My chest tightened, and for a moment, it felt like the walls were closing in on us. I could hear Lisa's shaky breath beside me. We were both terrified, but I knew we couldn't just stand there waiting for whatever this thing was to make its move. My mind was racing, searching for any way out, any escape, but it felt like there was no hope. We were cornered, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. Then I remembered something. The window. I whispered to Lisa, my voice barely audible. She looked at me confused. What? The window in the living room, I said, louder this time. It's unlocked. We can break through it. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance we had. I didn't know if we'd make it out alive, but staying here, standing in front of that thing, was a death wish. We had to try. The figure took a slow step toward us, its form shifting, almost like it was flickering between two different realities. That terrible, low laughter rumbled from deep within its chest again, making my skin crawl. Go! I screamed, grabbing Lisa's arm and pulling her toward the living room. We sprinted down the hall, not daring to look back. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind us, slow but deliberate, as if it was in no rush. It knew we were trapped, knew it had us. But I wasn't going to let it win. Not without a fight. The living room felt like it was a mile away, but we finally reached it. The window was there. Just like I remembered, the glass fogged up from the cold rain outside. I rushed toward it, fumbling to unlock the latch with shaking hands. The storm was still raging outside, the wind howling like a wild beast, but it was our only way out. I finally got the latch undone and tried to shove the window open, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was swollen from the rain, stuck tight in the frame. I pushed harder, panic rising in my chest as I felt the figure's presence growing closer. I could almost hear its breathing now, a slow, rasping sound that sent shivers down my spine. Come on, come on, I muttered under my breath, slamming my palm against the window. Lisa was beside me, her eyes wide with fear. It's coming, she cried, glancing over her shoulder. I could hear it too. The footsteps were louder now, echoing through the hallway. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, like the figure was draining all the oxygen out of the house. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the window. The glass shattered, sending shards flying everywhere. The cold, wet wind rushed in, whipping through the room and making the curtains billow like ghosts. But I didn't care. We had a way out. I grabbed Lisa's hand. Go! Crawl through. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the broken window, wincing as she cut her arm on a jagged piece of glass. I followed close behind, my heart racing as I pulled myself through the small opening, feeling the sharp glass scrape against my skin. We tumbled onto the wet grass outside, the rain instantly soaking us to the bone again. The wind whipped around us, and the storm was so loud it was hard to think, hard to even breathe. But we were outside. We were out. I turned to look back at the house, expecting to see the figure standing in the window, but there was nothing. Just the dark outline of the house against the stormy sky, the broken window staring back at us like a black hole. For a second, I almost let myself believe it was over. But then I saw movement. The figure stepped out of the shadows inside the house, slowly making its way toward the window. Its body seemed to blur in the dim light, like it wasn't fully solid. It moved with purpose, its head tilting slightly as it looked straight at us. I grabbed Lisa's arm. Run! We bolted through the yard, our feet slipping in the mud as we ran toward the street. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, but I didn't care. We had to keep going. We had to get away from that thing. Behind us, I could hear the sound of glass shattering even more. The figure was coming through the window. My heart raced even faster, fear gripping every part of me. We couldn't outrun it. Not like this. But just as we reached the street, headlights cut through the storm. A car was coming. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help, even though my voice was drowned out by the storm. The car slowed as it approached, its tires splashing through the flooded road. The driver's window rolled down, and I recognized the face behind the wheel. It was Lisa's dad. Get in, he yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm. Without thinking, we scrambled into the back seat, slamming the doors shut behind us. The instant we were inside, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We were safe. We had made it. But just as Lisa's dad started to drive away, I glanced out the rear window. The figure was standing in the middle of the street, watching us. It didn't chase the car. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, its dark form barely visible through the rain, watching us drive away. We drove in silence, the storm still raging outside, but inside the car, everything felt eerily calm. Lisa's dad didn't ask any questions. He didn't even seem surprised that we were running through the storm. He just kept driving, his eyes focused on the road ahead. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a small gas station on the edge of town. The lights inside flickered as the power tried to hold on, but it was a welcome sight, a sign of normalcy, of safety. We stumbled out of the car, drenched and exhausted, our bodies aching from the cold and fear. Lisa's dad led us inside the gas station, where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. It was empty, except for the cashier, who barely glanced at us as we walked in. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath, my mind still racing. Lisa stood beside me, shaking, her face pale. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What was that thing? Why was it after us?" I didn't have an answer. None of it made sense. The knocking, the figure, the messages, it was all like something out of a nightmare. But we were alive. We had escaped. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really, because when I looked out the gas station window, I thought I saw something. In the distance, barely visible through the storm, there was a figure, watching, waiting, and I knew, somehow, I hadn't escaped at all. I stood in the gas station, staring out the rain-streaked window. My heart sank as I spotted the figure again, barely visible through the storm. It was far away, standing still just like before. Watching, always watching. My chest tightened with fear, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me. Even here, in this brightly lit gas station, surrounded by the humming of fluorescent lights and the muted sound of the storm outside, I felt anything but safe. Lisa stood beside me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Her dad had gone to talk to the cashier, probably trying to get more information about the storm, but it didn't matter. No one could help us now, not with that thing still out there. "Do you see it?" I whispered to Lisa, my voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. She turned her gaze to the window, her expression tense. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then slowly she nodded. "Yeah, I see it." My stomach twisted. It was real. This wasn't just some figment of my imagination or a trick of the rain. The figure was still there, lurking in the distance, patiently waiting for us. "What are we supposed to do?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "We can't keep running forever." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the further we ran, the closer the figure seemed to get. It didn't matter how fast or how far we went. It always found us. Lisa's dad came back, a confused look on his face. "The storm's knocked out the phones in the area. I can't reach anyone, not the police, not anyone. We're gonna have to wait here until it clears up." I opened my mouth to tell him about the figure, about the knocking, about everything that had been happening to us, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something like this? It sounded insane. Even saying it out loud felt impossible. Instead, I just nodded, my mind racing. Maybe if we stayed inside, the figure wouldn't come. Maybe, just maybe, we could ride out the storm and whatever was chasing us would disappear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Lisa's dad gestured toward the small seating area in the corner of the gas station. "You girls should sit down and get warm. I'll see if they have some extra blankets." Lisa and I sat on one of the plastic benches, the cold seeping into our bones despite the fluorescent lights overhead. The place felt sterile, too bright, but it was a welcome change from the suffocating darkness we had escaped from. I wanted to believe we were safe here, even if just for a moment. But then my phone buzzed. I had almost forgotten it was in my pocket. With everything that had happened, I hadn't checked it since we ran from the house. My hands shook as I pulled it out, my heart already racing as I unlocked the screen. A message from the same unknown number. "You can't hide from me." I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat tightened, and my chest heaved as panic set in again. I turned the phone toward Lisa, showing her the message. Her eyes widened with horror. "It knows we're here," she whispered. I didn't respond. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out what to do next, but there were no answers. There never had been. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the rules of our world. It had followed us through the storm, through locked doors and broken windows. And now it had found us again. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The sound echoed through the gas station, making both of us jump. The cashier looked up from his magazine, confused but not alarmed. He must have thought it was just the storm. But I knew better. Lisa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to get out of here." I shook my head, my voice shaky. "Where do we go? We've run and run, and it's still following us. There's nowhere left to hide." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to come." Another loud bang reverberated through the gas station. This time, it was closer, more deliberate. It wasn't the storm. It was knocking. The front door rattled as something hit it from the outside, hard and insistent. Bang, bang, bang. The glass shook in its frame, the sound of it making my stomach twist in knots. The lights overhead flickered for a brief moment, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Lisa's dad rushed over to us, his face tense. "What the hell is that?" he asked, glancing toward the door. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for it to break open. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as if the figure knew it had all the time in the world. Bang, bang, bang. The cashier finally noticed something was wrong. He stood up from behind the counter, staring at the door in confusion. "Is someone out there?" he muttered, moving toward the entrance. "No," I screamed, leaping to my feet. "Don't open it." But it was too late. He unlocked the door, and the second the deadbolt clicked open, the door flew inward, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. And there it was. The figure stood in the doorway, tall and shadowy, its face obscured by darkness. The rain poured in behind it, soaking the floor and casting an eerie glow through the room. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, silent, waiting. The cashier backed away, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell?" he whispered. Lisa grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back of the gas station. "We have to go." But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, frozen in place by sheer terror. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence filling the room like a black void. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was being drained by its presence. Lisa's dad stepped in front of us, trying to shield us from the thing. "Stay back," he yelled, though his voice wavered with fear. "Stay back, or I'll—" Before he could finish, the lights flickered once more, and then, in an instant, they went out. We were plunged into total darkness. I couldn't see anything. The only sound was the pounding rain outside and the soft shuffle of footsteps as the figure moved closer. My heart raced, my mind spinning with fear. In the pitch black, I couldn't tell where we were. I reached out blindly, grabbing Lisa's arm, and pulled her close. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't know where we were going or how we'd escape, but we couldn't stay here. Not with that thing. We stumbled toward the back of the gas station, bumping into shelves and knocking over displays in the dark. The sound of the footsteps followed us, slow and steady, like the figure was playing with us, dragging out the terror. I felt my way along the wall until my hand hit a door. The back exit. I fumbled for the handle, my hands shaking as I twisted it and threw the door open. Cold wind and rain hit us like a wall as we stumbled outside, but I didn't care. We were out. We were away from it. For now. We ran through the storm, the rain blinding us as we stumbled toward the edge of the parking lot. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure right behind us, but it wasn't there. The gas station loomed in the distance, the front door still open, the lights flickering weakly inside. But the figure was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe we'd escaped. But then I heard it, a soft, familiar sound. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the gas station. It wasn't coming from behind us. It was coming from inside me. Inside my head, I could feel it deep in my bones, like it was part of me now. Like no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there. I looked at Lisa, my heart sinking, and then I knew this nightmare was never going to end. The rain was relentless, soaking us through as we stumbled away from the gas station, but I barely felt it. My mind was focused on one thing, the sound, the knocking. It was inside me now, echoing in my head like a drumbeat, slow and steady, as if it was marking the countdown to something inevitable. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through my body, as if the figure had somehow wormed its way into my very being. Lisa was beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly as we ran through the storm, but I knew from the look on her face that she was hearing it too. The same rhythmic knocking, growing louder and louder with every passing second. We hadn't escaped. We never had. No matter where we went, it would follow. It was a part of us now. We stumbled into a small alleyway behind the gas station, breathless and soaked, collapsing against the wall. The cold rain mixed with the dirt on the ground, turning everything into a muddy mess, but we didn't care. We just needed to catch our breath, to think, but the knocking wouldn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. It was constant now, like a metronome ticking away in the back of my mind. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. It was inside me. I can't take this, Lisa gasped, her eyes wide with fear. I can't do this anymore. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her that we'd figure it out, that we'd find a way to stop it, but I didn't believe that anymore. The figure had followed us everywhere, breaking through every barrier, every door. It had slipped into the very fabric of our reality, twisting it, bending it to its will. And now it was inside us. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It's in my head. Lisa nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mine too. It's like I can feel it. It's not just following us anymore, it's inside us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. That was it. That was why we could never escape. Why no matter where we ran, the figure always found us. It wasn't bound by space or time. It had latched onto us, and now it was pulling us into its world. A world where the rules didn't apply, where escape was impossible. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if it knew we were starting to understand. Knock, knock, knock. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands trembling. Why us? I whispered, not really expecting an answer. Why is it doing this? Lisa was silent for a moment, her breathing ragged as she leaned against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself. I don't know. Maybe we opened a door we weren't supposed to. Maybe it's always been there, waiting for someone like us to notice. I didn't want to believe that. I didn't want to believe that we had somehow brought this on ourselves. But deep down, I knew she was right. There had been something wrong from the very beginning, something dark and twisted that had been lurking just beneath the surface of our reality. And somehow, we had pulled it into our world. Or maybe it had pulled us into its world. The knocking stopped. I blinked in surprise, the sudden silence almost more terrifying than the sound itself. I glanced at Lisa, her eyes wide with confusion. The rain continued to pour down around us, the wind howling through the alley, but the knocking, it was gone. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the figure had finally given up, or maybe it had moved on to someone else. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't true. This wasn't the end. This was something else, something worse. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the alleyway, bouncing off the wet walls and filling the air with dread. The figure had found us again. I could feel it, that same suffocating presence creeping closer, pulling us back into its grasp. Lisa grabbed my arm, her eyes wild with fear. "We have to go," she whispered urgently. "We have to run." But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something inside me was telling me that running wasn't going to help anymore. Wherever we went, the figure would follow. It wasn't about the physical space anymore. It was about us. We had brought this thing into our lives, and now it was inside us. There was no escaping it. "No," I said quietly, shaking my head. "We can't run anymore. We have to face it. Lisa stared at me, disbelief written all over her face. What? Are you crazy? We can't face that thing. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. It's inside us now, Lisa. We can't outrun it. We can't hide from it. The only way this ends is if we confront it. I wasn't even sure what I meant by that. How do you confront something like this? Something that defies logic, that bends the very laws of reality? But deep down, I knew it was the only way. Running had gotten us nowhere. Hiding had only delayed the inevitable. Lisa's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded slowly, resigned to the truth. Okay, she whispered. Okay, but how? The footsteps were closer now, just around the corner. I could feel the air growing colder, heavier. The figure was almost here. I took a deep breath, my body trembling. We stopped being afraid. Lisa looked at me like I was insane, but I stood my ground. Fear had fed this thing. Every time we ran, every time we hid, it grew stronger. It thrived on our terror, on our desperation. If we were going to survive this, we had to take that power away from it. The figure finally appeared at the mouth of the alley, its dark form silhouetted against the rain-soaked night. It stood there, perfectly still, watching us with that same unsettling patience. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me with its cold, dark energy. But I refused to give in to the fear. I took a step forward, my heart racing, but my mind focused. "You don't scare me," I said, my voice steady. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting to see what we would do next. Lisa looked at me, fear still in her eyes, but she nodded. She stepped forward too, standing beside me. "You don't scare us," she said, her voice shaky but determined. The figure remained motionless, its presence still heavy and oppressive. But something shifted. The air around us felt different, lighter. The knocking in my head started to fade, growing quieter with each passing second. "You don't control us," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You're nothing." For a moment, nothing happened. The figure just stood there, silent, as if weighing our words. But then, slowly, it began to fade. Its dark form grew thinner, less solid, until it was nothing more than a shadow, a wisp of darkness dissolving into the night. And just like that, it was gone. The rain continued to pour, but the air felt lighter now, less suffocating. I could breathe again. I could think. The knocking was gone, replaced by the soft patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Lisa looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. Did we beat it? I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel its presence anymore. The figure was gone. The nightmare was over. We stood there in the rain, soaked and exhausted, but alive. We had faced our fear, and somehow we had survived. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some nightmares never really end. The rain finally began to ease, the storm tapering off into a soft drizzle as Lisa and I stood in the alley, soaked and trembling but alive. The figure was gone. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. It had vanished before our eyes, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never existed at all. But even as the night grew quieter, that eerie stillness didn't bring me comfort. It felt like a pause, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. Lisa stood beside me, her face pale, her hair plastered to her forehead from the rain. She was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself, but she wasn't crying anymore. We had survived, but we both knew it wasn't over. Not really. I wiped my face, trying to clear the water from my eyes, and glanced back toward the gas station. It seemed so far away now, like another world entirely. The bright fluorescent lights glowed weakly in the distance, casting long, flickering shadows across the parking lot. But the figure wasn't there. The knocking had stopped. Everything was still. "I think we did it," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I think it's gone." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something inside me wouldn't let go of the fear that had settled deep in my bones. It was the same feeling I'd had since the very beginning, since the first knock at my door. A lingering sense that we weren't alone, that the figure was still watching, still waiting. "We should go back," I said, trying to sound confident. "We should tell your dad everything. Get out of here." Lisa hesitated, glancing down the alley as if expecting the figure to reappear. She bit her lip, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, you're right. Let's get out of the rain." We walked in silence, our footsteps splashing through the puddles, the cool rain running down our backs. My heart was still racing, even though the danger seemed to have passed. The figure had disappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return. When we reached the gas station, Lisa's dad was waiting for us inside, pacing nervously near the counter. He looked up when he saw us walk through the door, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you're okay," he said, rushing over. "Where the hell did you girls go? I thought you'd—" He stopped when he saw the look on our faces. "We need to leave," I said, my voice steady. "Now!" Lisa's dad furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "What's going on? What happened?" I glanced at Lisa, who looked just as exhausted and terrified as I felt. We hadn't even begun to explain everything to her dad. He had no idea what we had been through, what had followed us, and even if we tried to explain, I wasn't sure he'd believe us. How could anyone believe something like that? "There was someone following us," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something." Her dad's face softened with concern, but I could tell he didn't fully understand. He put a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. Let's get you both somewhere safe." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of urgency building inside me. "Please, we just need to leave this place. Now!" Lisa's dad didn't argue. He could see how shaken we were. Without another word, he led us back to the car, and we climbed into the back seat. The warmth of the car felt comforting at first, but as we pulled away from the gas station and onto the empty highway, the feeling of safety quickly evaporated. The road stretched ahead of us, dark and endless, the trees on either side of the road casting long, eerie shadows. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes, trying to block out the events of the past few hours. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The figure. The dark void where its face should have been. The knocking. Knock, knock, knock. No. I had to stop thinking about it. It was over. It had to be. Lisa shifted beside me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She glanced at me, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing. Neither of us could shake it. The feeling that something was still wrong, that the nightmare wasn't truly over. After about 10 minutes on the road, the rain had finally stopped, leaving everything damp and misty. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass, but the storm had passed, leaving only a heavy fog that clung to the trees like a blanket. The highway was eerily empty, no other cars, no signs of life. Just us driving through the mist. I glanced out the window, staring into the fog, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. Standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the mist, was the figure. I gasped, my stomach twisting in knots. It was just a fleeting glimpse, a shadowy figure standing still among the trees. But I knew it was real. It was real. "Stop the car!" I yelled, my voice panicked. Lisa's dad hit the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty road. He turned to look at me, alarmed. What? What is it?" But I was already out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood on the side of the road, staring into the trees where I had seen it. But the figure was gone. The mist was thick, swirling around the trees, obscuring everything. Lisa got out of the car too, looking around frantically. "What did you see? What's wrong?" I pointed toward the trees, my hand trembling. It was there. I saw it. The figure. Her face paled. She didn't need to ask what I meant. She knew. We both did. But there was nothing there now. Just the fog, thick and impenetrable. Lisa's dad got out of the car, clearly confused. "There's nothing out here," he said, looking around. "You're both just scared. It's been a long night. Let's get back in the car and get you someplace safe." I didn't argue. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the figure was gone for good. But as I climbed back into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The car started up again, and we drove in silence for a few more miles. The fog was thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a winding, endless highway leading us nowhere. Then, out of nowhere, the car's engine sputtered. Lisa's dad frowned, glancing at the dashboard. "What the?" he muttered, tapping the gas pedal. The car shuddered, and the engine died completely. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the car's headlights cutting through the fog, but showing nothing but empty highway ahead of us. Lisa's dad cursed under his breath. "Great. Just great." He turned to us, his expression tight. "Stay in the car. I'll check the engine." He got out, slamming the door behind him. Lisa and I sat in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to choke. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, making it feel like we were trapped in a bubble of mist. I glanced at Lisa. Her hands were shaking again, her face pale. "What if it's still out there?" she whispered. I didn't know how to answer. Then suddenly the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. But this time it wasn't in my head. It was coming from outside the car, right next to us. Lisa's eyes widened in horror, and I turned slowly toward the passenger side window. The figure stood there, its dark form barely visible through the fog, its face, or lack of one, pressed against the glass. "Knock, knock, knock!" We screamed. Lisa's dad jumped back into the car, slamming the door shut. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled, but we couldn't answer. We were too terrified to speak. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its hand tapping rhythmically on the window, as if it was waiting for us to do something, waiting for us to make a mistake. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then the car's lights flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. No knocking, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the fog and the darkness. Then, the voice came again, low and whispering. "You can't run from me." And I knew, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that this nightmare was never going to end. Not for us. Not ever. The darkness was suffocating. The car's headlights had gone out, leaving us trapped in a bubble of blackness. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, fast and ragged, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. The figure was still outside, tapping on the window with that horrible, slow rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The sound felt like it was inside me again, vibrating through my chest, echoing in my bones. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. No light, no movement, just that figure, its presence looming over us in the fog. Lisa clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the knocking. I didn't know. I had no plan, no idea how to fight something that wasn't even fully part of our world. It had followed us for so long, slipping through every door, every escape. I thought we had faced it, but we hadn't. We had never been in control. This thing had been toying with us, feeding on our fear. I looked over at Lisa's dad in the front seat. He was staring out the window, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't seen what we'd seen. He didn't understand the danger we were in, but he could feel it now, just like we could. He was frozen, just as helpless as we were. Then, without warning, the car door next to Lisa flew open. She screamed, her body jerking away from the sudden rush of cold air and fog that poured into the car. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but the figure was already there. It moved so fast, slipping through the fog like a shadow, its hand reaching out toward her. I could see it now, clearly, its dark, shapeless form, the empty void where a face should have been. I screamed, throwing myself between Lisa and the figure. I swung my arm, trying to push it back, but my hand passed through it like it was nothing more than mist. The cold that emanated from it was unbearable, freezing me to my core. Lisa's dad was shouting now, trying to slam the door shut, but the figure didn't budge. It stood there, half inside the car, its empty face turned toward us, its hand reaching, and then, just as its fingers brushed against my skin, everything stopped. The knocking, the cold, the fog, it all froze, as if time itself had come to a standstill. The figure was still there, its hand outstretched, but it didn't move. The world was silent. I didn't dare breathe. Then slowly the figure lowered its hand. It stepped back from the car, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was being pulled away by some unseen force. For the first time, it wasn't chasing us. It wasn't hunting. It was retreating. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as the figure dissolved into the fog, disappearing from sight. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, Lisa's dad slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fear. Neither of us could answer. We sat there, staring at the spot where the figure had vanished, too stunned to move. The silence in the car was suffocating, the air thick with tension. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had it stopped? Why had it left? Then I heard something, faint but unmistakable. A voice, soft and distant, like it was coming from far away. "You opened the door." My blood ran cold. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The door. That's what this had all been about. From the very beginning, we had opened a door we were never supposed to touch. Not a literal door, but something else. Something deeper. I turned to Lisa, my hand shaking. "It's not just following us because we're running," I whispered. "It's following us because we opened the door to it. We let it in." Lisa stared at me, her eyes wide with horror. "What do you mean? How do we let it in?" I struggled to find the words, but deep down I knew. All the strange events, the knocks, the figure showing up in our lives, it had all started the same way. With that first knock, that first moment of hesitation when we had heard the noise and ignored our instincts. We acknowledged it. I said finally, my voice trembling. We gave it power by paying attention to it. We let it into our lives when we responded to the knocking. It's not just some random thing. It's something that needs us to fear it, to open ourselves to it. Lisa's dad was staring at me now, confusion and fear etched on his face. "What are you talking about? What door? What is this thing?" "It's been waiting," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "Waiting for someone to notice. And once we did, once we reacted to it, we let it into our lives. It feeds on fear, on attention. That's why it won't go away." For a long moment, none of us spoke. The weight of what I had just said hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Lisa looked like she was on the verge of tears, her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of the seat. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say that we could ignore it, that if we stopped fearing it, stopped paying attention to it, it would go away. But I knew it wasn't that simple. This thing had wormed its way into our reality, and it wasn't going to leave without a fight. But then, something strange happened. The fog outside the car began to lift. Slowly at first, but then faster, until we could see the road ahead of us again. The mist thinned, revealing the dark, empty highway stretching into the distance. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over us since the figure first appeared seemed to lighten, as if a curtain had been lifted, and the knocking had stopped. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. Lisa's dad took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. He turned the key in the ignition, and to my surprise, the car roared to life. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the remaining fog, and we began to move. As we drove down the highway, the tension in the car slowly began to fade. Lisa leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed, exhausted from everything we had been through. I stared out the window, my mind still racing, but the figure was gone. The fog had lifted. We were finally free, or so it seemed, but deep down, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. Not really. It had retreated, yes, but it was still out there, watching, waiting. It had found us once, and it could find us again, because we had opened the door. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun.